Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm gonna try this. Terima kasih kerana menjemput saya. Thank you all very much for the invitation to speak at this conference. I've been given the almost impossible task to not cover one civilization in half an hour, but two main civilizations. We like to think of them as European, but of course I think what my talk will make clear is that they are much more than just Europe, and there is a lot of contact. And as Dr. Kenneth has shown, of course, the Romans especially, there was so much trade, so much going on that they really exceed the boundaries of Europe and North Africa. This is the first area I'll talk about. This is Greece. Of course, this is the Mediterranean Sea. Greece is highlighted there with some of the main cities that we see there. And this is the peninsula. You see the Peloponnesus, which is really where Greek civilization, Greek culture developed. But of course, when we want to talk about Greek civilization, we have to look a little bit at what goes on before there, and those are the Mycenaean and the Minoan civilizations. So these are two civilizations that are much, much earlier. We're talking about the 2nd millennium BC, that both of them are at their peak. First of all, the Minoan civilization. The Minoan civilization focused on Crete, so you see there, the island of Crete in the south. A very large civilization, a very rich civilization, and you see they have already monumental architecture. This is around 1600, 1500 BC, where they built monumental structures, and it was a civilization focusing on palaces. There was a king, there were local kings, there were several on the island. They built big palaces, and it was an agricultural society. So the riches of the society was also stored in the palaces. It was very much, it's an island, so of course it's very much based on the sea, it's focused on the sea, and a lot of the art that they produce focuses on that sea. We are specifically focused here on some wall paintings that show dolphins in the Mediterranean Sea. But also the octopus, the squid, on this type of pottery that really the Minoan civilization first started doing, painting their pottery with maritime motifs. At the end of the Minoan civilization, we're still talking 1500 BC, there's also the Mycenaean civilization. This is on mainland Greece, the peninsula. Mycenae is the core, and again these are local states, all building very, very large structures. You can see there, again, palaces in stone with monumental structure, and you can see the very famous Lion Gate that is at Mycenae. They're an agricultural society, but the power is in the hand of the local kings. And this is a society that's represented in, you might know, the big stories of the Trojan War, the big epic that was written in the 8th century BC, but really goes back to events of the 12th century BC, the end of the Mycenaean civilization. And so they produced similar style of pottery as the Minoans, but a little bit more evolved, still painted, so white slit ware with painted decoration. The Greek peninsula really goes into a state of what people like to call the Dark Ages. We don't really know what's happening. For a long time we didn't know what's happening. Now, of course, slowly, more and more archaeological remains are coming up that in fact they do lose a lot of their crafts, they lose a lot of their artistic, and especially monumental building. There is no monumental building in Greece between, let's say, 1200 BC and 900, 800 BC. What you see is wooden structures. This is still the palace of a local lord, the palace of a local ruler, but it's all in wood. And these are the main, this is a very famous site, Left Kandi. This is the structure, so there is some loss. Peoples do die out, peoples get lost, new peoples are coming in. And what you see on the right is a centaur, so the pottery does continue, pottery styles do continue, that is a craft they do not lose. And this shows that at that time period, in the 9th century BC, the 8th century BC, this is when the first hints to what we really recognize as, what we really think of as Greek culture today come into being, because the centaur is this mythological being that is clearly connected to the Greek pantheon of gods. And the gods I'll focus on in a second, because the other innovation in the 8th century BC is the alphabet, the Greek alphabet that comes into play. It's there on the left. What is actually shown in this slide is how the Greek alphabet evolves through Etruscans, of which I will talk later, into the Roman, the Latin alphabet that we still use today, that you also still use in Malaysia. That comes into the 8th century BC, and what you see is that the pot with the earliest known inscription in the Greek language. And it is a line from what I was just saying, the Iliad, the story of the Trojan War, mentioning the Greek gods already, mentioning those epics, mentioning those stories, just as a centaur, mentioning all these gods. We see here the 12 gods of the Greek pantheon. They had many more, but these were the main gods. And especially their main god, their main god was Zeus and his wife Hera, and Athena, the goddess of war. They were the most important gods, and they show up everywhere, and they'll show up in the talk as well. In the 8th century BC, also when we think of globalization on a much smaller scale, but the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games, to which peoples from outside the boundaries of the Greek culture did come and participate. In the 8th century also, the Greeks start colonizing areas of the Mediterranean. We see there in orange, everywhere around the Mediterranean that Greeks went to from the 8th century BC. And of course that enhanced trade, a lot of trade. They traded with the Egyptian cultures of the time in the south, they traded with the Phoenicians that were in the east, but also dominated the Phoenicians, who also had ports on the western side of the Mediterranean. And we see all these objects popping up in Greek culture. Moving on, they start developing their own style. We see here the Archaic period around the 6th century BC, and now we're talking largely that earliest phase of where we are today, the site today that we're celebrating today. These earliest phases, this is a sculpture, the first monumental sculpture since really the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, who had barely any freestanding sculpture, but very heavily borrowed from Egyptian sculpture. It's a pity that Dr. Zayawaz isn't here, because he would have talked about it. It clearly links back to Egyptian sculpture, and the Greeks take that on, but then personalize it, make it Greek. The same with pottery. You've seen the top left one already. That was the Mycenaean bowl. But you see how the pottery that we find in Athens, Sparta, Corinth, the main Greek cities of the 6th, 5th, 4th century BC, they produce the same style of pottery. And especially in later times, the 5th, 4th century BC, you see those two types of pottery at the bottom, which we call black figure and red figure vases. It's a different technique of oxidizing the pottery. Actually, what you paint is the background, and through oxidization process, the foreground comes out, either in black or in red. And of course, in the 6th century BC, this is what we think of when we think of the Greek culture, is big temples. In the 6th century BC, they start building this monumental architecture. This is one in Sicily. So where they colonized Sicily, which is now an Italian island, and they built temples, bigger than temples that we find in Greece itself, actually, slightly remarkable. And some of these temples, some of these structures become known as the wonders of the world. I know this is a very European perspective. Because the wonders of the world for the Greeks were, for example, this one, the temple of the Olympian Zeus, their main god, in Delphi. And you see the size of the statue that they were able to create. The statue probably in wood, but covered in gold and textiles, very, very important textiles. Also, the temple of Artemis, another goddess of hunting was Artemis. The temple of Artemis in Ephesus, the Greek colonized the western coast of Turkey. And there is one of the wonders of the world. Of course, we shouldn't forget other wonders of the world, were the pyramids in Egypt, or the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. So they did know, they were interconnected. They did know what was going on in the other parts of the world, always through trade. They had trade with, as Dr. Ken has shown, with the Persian empires. They fought the Persian empires, but they also had trade with them. They probably had trade routes even with India, and I'll talk about those when we get to the Roman period. One final monument, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus. You can see the size there, it's more than 50 meters high, and remains of it. You see the sculptures still surviving actually in the British Museum with us. Some of the sculptures surviving, just the sheer scale of these things that are being built in the 5th and 4th century BC. The most important monument in Greece, the most important city, was Athens, and of course the Acropolis, that was the main hill in the center of the city, is really the main, that core of the city. You can see there what still remains, so all of that is still standing, and there's a fanciful reconstruction for you. It's actually not too bad, it's a very romantic view from 100 years ago, but if you think away the giant sculpture in the background, it's actually a fairly accurate reconstruction of what the Acropolis must have looked like. Because on the Acropolis was the most important temple to the Greeks, the Parthenon here. And I show the Parthenon on the one hand because we have a lot of its sculpture in the British Museum, but also because it is still considered, because of its state of preservation, it is still considered one of the most beautiful architectural sculpture of the Greek period of ancient Greece. You can see there, for example, the frieze that was running all the way around the temple on the inside that shows a procession. It's a temple, it's the Parthenon, it's to Parthenope, what was another name for Athena, the goddess Athena, so it's a temple to Athena. It's a beautiful sculpture, and what we always tend to forget, of course, is, which you know in Southeast Asia and in Asia, that a lot of sculpture has always been painted and very colorful and very bright. But in Europe we've kind of lost that, and we have this tradition of white sculpture. We like white marble, we like black marble, or non-painted. But it was all painted before, and so this is, for example, a reconstruction of what the Parthenon sculptures would have looked like originally, and the temple itself. There's a lot of blue, there's a lot of gold, there's a lot of red. That's the pediment. It shows basically all the gods there celebrating the birth of Athena, who is represented here in the center with her father Zeus. And this slide is here just to show this remarkable progress that we have from only the 6th century BC to the 3rd century BC. In 250 years, they make so much progress from an art style that comes really from the Egyptians to an art style that they call their own, that is much more plastic, that is much more vibrant, much more alive. You know, it's more realistic as well. And it happened. I mean, I've shown here both female representations, but also the male representations. Politically, Greece was never unified. We call it ancient Greece, but they were all individual city-states. They were all individual, almost kingdoms, even though they didn't have kings. They were ruled, for a long time, they were ruled democratically by elected members of the council. But Athens was always at the foreground, and Athens was loved by some, but hated by others, because it was always putting itself forward. So here you see a slide of the 5th, 4th century BC. All the different allies that are working together with Athens, all the different allies with Sparta. And of course, this brings a rupture into the system. And all these cities, instead of unifying, they all still fight each other constantly, and it weakens the state. The Persians are not a threat anymore, but now the new threat, which eventually wasn't really that much damaging, but came from the north. And this is Alexander the Great. You probably have heard of Alexander the Great before, who came from Macedonia, the kingdom here in the north of Greece. His father, really, Philip of Macedonia, Philip II of Macedonia, is the one who conquered Greece. But it's Alexander who then goes off and starts conquering the known world. You know, again, a very European perspective to talk about this. But to the Greeks, the known world was what you see in purple on this map. It's quite an accomplishment, because Alexander did this in just around 10 years' time. He conquered most of Egypt, he conquered most of what was left of the Persian Empire, and he went all the way to India, all the way to the Oxus, all the way to the main river that bordered on India, Afghanistan. It was an amazing feat. He built a lot of cities there. This, of course, improved trade. This, of course, improved influence. Here you see actually the expedition that he did. But this is an influence that could be felt for hundreds of years to come. And I'm sure that Dr. Khan will still talk about it, because especially in Gandhara, the influence of the Greeks remains there. And so, for example, several Buddhist gods and Hindu gods start being represented in Greek-style clothing or Greek hairstyles. And you see, for example, the gods Panchika and Harita here. Harita, I've put here the comparison with the Greek goddess Tyche, holding the cornucopia, the horn of wealth, of plenty. And it's the same there in the sculpture from Gandhara. The god, the semi-god, the demigod, Hercules, also, he became Vajrapani, the protector of the Buddha. And you see here in Gandhara, in Gandhara relief, here he is. Hercules represented that. And the Buddha himself, you see Buddha here represented in Greek clothing. You see here the Himatian, this is a typical Greek style clothing. And the knot on top of his head, very reminiscent, if I can go back, very reminiscent of the Apollo statues, typical Greek Apollo statues, the knot on the head. Now, at that time, just after Alexander the Great, Alexander conquers it, but he dies very young. And he has an heir, but he's killed, and so the empire really immediately collapses. It splinters into several different states. This is also a time that there is a new superpower in the Mediterranean, and no one could stop this new superpower. Now we're talking about the Romans. Now the Romans, they just don't appear out of nothing in the 3rd century BC. They've had their own evolution, and according to myth, their city, Rome, is founded in 753 BC. That's the myth. And they have 2 myths, and the Romans don't see any problem with the fact that they have 2 different myths that are different in time. There's, first of all, the most famous myth is, of course, the twin brothers Romulus and Remus that were left to die by their parents, but were rescued by a she-wolf and then suckled in a cave. On the left you see the different myth that was invented at a later time, saying that Aeneas, who escaped the Trojan War, so the end of the Mycenaean period, the start of the Greek period, who escaped the Trojan War, his son Ascanius, he went to Italy and his son Ascanius founded Rome. Now this was a propaganda device that a later emperor used, but the she-wolf, they even think, some people think at least in Italian archaeology, that they can locate the cave where the she-wolf suckled the twins. Now, it's all myth. But this is a sort of reconstruction of what the site of Rome would have looked like at the time. Hills. And that is actually the reality. Rome was founded, Rome became Rome by a joining together of several hilltop villages just by the most important crossing of the Tiber River. The Tiber River on the west coast of Italy, that really was where all the trade routes of the western coast, north-south, and east-west, because you have a mountain range in the center of Italy. So any trade going over the mountains would cross by the Tiber. Anything north-south would go by the Tiber. And it's all these little villages, it's the 7 hills of Rome, that at some point in the 8th, 7th century BC, join together, and they become a superpower. Here it is. And it really just starts out with being this one city, then conquering the rest of the area around them, all the different peoples around them. I mean, I might name them, but you lose their name to me, the Sabines, the Samnites, all of these peoples, they become Roman, and it's really the northern people that give the Romans the most trouble, the Etruscans. The Etruscans, who survived as a separate people for a very, very long time. The Romans hated them, they hated the Romans. But eventually, Rome in its early stage was clearly almost an Etruscan city. And I'll show that in a second. The other people I want to point out is that the Greeks, of course, had colonized a lot of the Mediterranean. So they were very much present in the south of Italy. And they influenced the Romans as well. And the Carthaginians, who were remnants of the Phoenicians, and all people from Israel, Lebanon, from that coastline that had settled in North Africa at the time. Now, it really is an Etruscan city, because the Romans themselves, they were these hilltop villages that were influenced by the Etruscans. The Etruscans were seafaring peoples. They were the ones who had all the contacts with mainly Greece. And the Etruscans loved Greek culture. They took over the alphabet to write their own language. They took over their pottery. More Greek pottery has been found in Italy, in Etruscan sites, than has ever been found in Greece itself. So it became a product of export, of trade. The same with the little figurines. The figurines, the art that starts emerging in Etruscan cities and also in Rome, is clearly based on the Greek sculpture. You see there the one that I've shown before from the archaic period, 6th century BC, this contrapposto, so the weight on one leg, very frontal viewing. It's got that we find in little bronze figurines of the Etruscan period from Rome. So these are found in Rome. Writing. The Romans started writing their language in the alphabet that they take from the Etruscans, but the Etruscans had taken it from the Greeks. And of course it's a different language. They lose some of the letters. And they write it slightly differently. It's an evolution. But they just take the alphabet basically from the Greeks. And so early Rome is really an Etruscan city. The main buildings built in the 7th and 6th century BC are the city walls, clearly inspired by Etruscan architecture, and 3 main temples in the center, in the political center of Rome, clearly inspired, 1 by Greek architecture and 2 by Etruscan architecture. Greeks built in marble, but the Romans hadn't yet come across a source of marble in Italy. So they built everything in limestone and terracotta, just as the Etruscans did. Here you see the temple of Hurst and Minerva in the Forum Bovarium, in limestone, in terracotta. It's a Greek-style temple, but the gods now have different names, but they are still Greek gods. The temple of Jupiter, who is Zeus, Greek Zeus, on the Capitoline, the most important hill in Rome, clearly a Greek-style temple, but built in an Etruscan manner, with wider spacing between the front columns, all in terracotta, clearly influence taken from somewhere else. This is a typical, just to show that comparison, this is a typical Etruscan temple found in the Etruscan city of Veii to the north of Rome. And you see it's exactly the same kind of temple. It's obviously a reconstruction of the remains. But the sculpture on the side, which was one of the acroteria, one of the sculptures on top of that temple, is original. And it is almost, it's the same style as we find here, Hercules and Minerva of the Roman gods. According to myth, Rome is ruled by kings. From 753 to 509 BC, they have 7 kings. 4 Latin ones, Roman Latin ones, and 3 Etruscan ones. It's clearly a myth that reflects reality. It reflects the heavy Etruscan influence that was happening in Rome at the time. But around the turn of the 5th century, of the 6th to 5th century BC, following events all over the Mediterranean, also in Greece, also in Sicily, also further in the east, they are getting rid of dictatorship, they're getting rid of kingship, and they want to go towards more a democracy, an oligarchy, ruled by a senate, by a council of people. And according to myth, it is Brutus who kicks out the last of the Roman Etruscan kings, actually, Tarquinius Superbus. In reality, yes, these are names, they're probably not correct, but these shifts did actually happen. We see that in the 5th century BC, a system, a new class system, a new political system comes into place into Rome. And so, on the one hand, it's a very rigid, you can see it's a very rigid class system. I hope this slide really comes out. But it shows that you have slaves in the lowest position that could remain slaves or be free. You have plebeians, who are just the general people, the normal people, who could be poor, plebeians we call them, or wealthy. Or you have patricians. This is the old elite. These are the old elite families that remain elite. It doesn't matter how much money they have or what they accomplish. They will always remain elite. Now what you will see is that throughout time, here we have 500 BC, we have 200 BC, the system becomes less rigid. Slaves could be free and acquire wealth. They could become wealthy citizens. They could never reach the patrician. They could never become the old elite, but they could become as wealthy as that old elite. And they are what we would today call the nouveau riche. They were looked down upon by these old elite, of course, but they acquired a lot of wealth. The same could happen with just the plebeians, with the normal people, that didn't have that lineage, but could still acquire large portions of wealth. Rome was then governed by all these people, and it is really those, the Senate, it's all the different tribes, tribal assemblies that push for domination, for conquest. Rome thinks at least that it is bigger and better than anyone else. And when they have conquered the whole of Italy and Sicily in the 3rd century BC, they start looking elsewhere. And so slowly, over the next 3 centuries, they start conquering the entire Mediterranean. They take the Carthaginians in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. They take Greece. You see how splintered that kingdom of Alexander the Great had become. It had fragmented in all these different smaller kingdoms. They take them one by one, either by force, or these kingdoms were sometimes happy to join the Roman Empire because they saw benefits in it. After having conquered all these states, I show this because these are some names that you might have heard of. After the big wars outside of Rome, they get civil war within Rome and within Italy. And you all have heard of Julius Caesar, who was one of the plebeian, really, he was one of the lower classes, who was a very, he wanted to be one of the plebeians actually. He was in touch with the proletariat. He wanted to, he probably wanted to become a king, and they hated him for it. and so they murdered him. But then there's a whole range of these generals, of these big important names, like Mark Antony, who hooked up with Cleopatra in Egypt, that all strive for domination, for sole rulership. Eventually it is Augustus, the first Roman Emperor Augustus, who really wins the day, wins the game. He becomes the first emperor. He was never meant to become emperor, because once the emperor was established, there is still a senate, there are still consuls, there are still assemblies, but they're more for show, because the emperor has the sole authority. It's a clever way that Augustus managed to draw all the power to himself, because in essence, the republic, what went before him, never really died. Never really died. He just became the sole commander of the armies, the chief priest of the Roman Empire. He was the commander of the naval force, and all these powers together made him emperor. But he was never an official position, which is a strange thing. And of course you've heard of all these names. It was never meant to be also, the emperor was never meant to be a dynastic thing. It was never meant to be inherited, but it just naturally became inherited. So Augustus's son, adoptive son, Tiberius, became emperor after him. Tiberius adopted Caligula, well, it was nephew. Caligula became emperor. So those first 5 emperors you see on the top is what we call the Julio-Claudian dynasty. They're all of the same family. They go from very good Augustus to worse and worse, Caligula and Nero, who were crazy people that were just out for their own gain. Vespasian again is one of the good emperors, and so it's a bit of a game in Roman politics. You know, what's the next emperor? Who is the next emperor going to be? Who is the biggest general, or who is the nicest son of the previous emperor? Eventually though, under the empire, this is what the Roman Empire, and I always like to impress with this slide, but after Derek here showed this slide of the largest empires in the world, this means nothing. You've seen that the Umayyad Empire was double the size of the Roman Empire. Still, the Roman Empire probably had 100 million people in it. Rome itself up to 1 million people. It encompasses almost 50 provinces, which accounts for almost 40 modern countries around the Mediterranean. And you see it goes all the way to Iraq. But it depends, and how did they manage it? Well, they managed it through a very effective road system. You can see it there. They had boundaries, they had frontiers with peoples that caused trouble. This could be the Great Wall of China. It's actually the wall of Hadrian's Wall, in the north of Britain. They built it here because they get so much trouble with the Celtic tribes in the north, in what is now Scotland, the Picts, who are invading, that Hadrian builds this wall. People sometimes think it's the only wall, but it's not true. In Morocco, there are several walls that the Romans built to bound off their empire. There are several in Egypt. There are some also in the Middle East. And that creates an effective way for armies to travel around. And when they create armies, they always station them somewhere. So they would take soldiers from Egypt and position them in England, so that there wasn't too much affection to their own province, and the affection was only to Rome, to the idea of Rome, the great empire. I'm going to skip these, but these are some of the great monuments that they built. This is Rome itself, one of the main temples, the temple of Mars Ultor, the war god Mars. Now this becomes a temple. You see, it's inspired by Greeks. The art is inspired again by Greek. This is a statue here of Augustus, clearly inspired by Greek statues. So it's this golden, Augustus specifically, and the Roman emperors after him, start modeling their rule, their empire after the Greek empire. And it becomes exported. We then find the same style of architecture all through the Roman Empire, in various degrees. Some regions were much more prepared to take up this architecture and this way of life than other regions. But you see here, Algeria, Syria, France, Turkey, all the same type of architecture that we find in Rome itself, in the western provinces and in the eastern provinces. This, I was very happy to see this on the Kedah poster, the Colosseum. This is where they held their big games, this is where people fought each other, where they fought wild beasts. Again, a type of architecture exported to the provinces. This is not important. I want to focus a little bit on trade, just for the last 2 or 3 minutes, because that focuses more, that matches more theme of why we are here. Trade takes enormous proportions. There's a little quote that I'll read out from the 2nd century AD that talks about Rome. And it says, Rome, so many ships arrive here from anywhere during any season. The city looks like a collective market for the entire world. You can marvel at cargoes from India and Arabia, or clothing from Babylonia. Ships never cease to come and go. The Mediterranean and further east was just hundreds and thousands of ships on a daily basis. The Romans, we know, went certainly as far as India. The main trading post, Petani, Dirk already mentioned, you have Muzirs. Sri Lanka, they knew Sri Lanka, and it was, the Roman name was Taprobe. They traded heavily with them because they had goods that they wanted. It was especially ivory. There were precious stones like sapphires, garnets, carnelians, agate, diamonds. Pearls came from India and further east. Silk and pepper. Now silk, of course, wasn't made in India. That came from China. So that was the indirect trading. But with India, there was direct trading. And we can see some of these. You can see, these are far apart. This is a tomb relief from Syria. From Syria, Palmyra in Syria. This is a tomb painting from Egypt. Both women wear the same type of jewelry and especially the same type of earrings. And the earrings are there with pearls or with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. All these became the fashion in the Roman Empire, and they went as far west as Britain. You find the same type of earrings in Britain. And in Sicily you find, I'll finish with this, in Sicily there is this beautiful mosaic here, a representation of the province of India. And she's a dark-skinned woman, and how do we know she's Indian? Well, there's an Indian elephant on the side. There's a tiger on the right. And what is here behind her, hanging from the tree, is dried pepper. Pepper was one of the main spices to go to the Roman Empire, and it came, of course, from India and further east. So this trade with the East was very, very heavy. We are only in the last 10 years, people are looking more and more into it, into this trade. This is the globalization, the connectivity that Dirk was also talking about. It is still, we need more contact between the East and the West. There are documents that Roman archaeologists, historians know nothing about, that talk about this trade, that talk about more, that have more information about this, that we need to start looking into.